I'm Oliver, the Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, and I'm introducing, and doing the first part of what we're sharing. And for the purposes of audio description, I am a white male with blondish hair, sitting in front of a brown door and a white wardrobe. So that's me. I'm joined for this presentation by my colleagues Ella and Megan. So if you want to introduce yourselves in turn, and then we will carry on.
Hi, thanks, Ollie. I'm Ella. I'm an evidence researcher with the Audience Agency in the Evidence and Insight team, and I'll be speaking in the second half of the presentation. For, again, the purposes of audience description, I'm a white female with brown hair in her early 30s. Yeah, looking forward to talking to you about behaviour.
Hi everyone, I'm Megan. I'm a white woman. I've got sort of shoulder length dark brown hair. I'm wearing a black t-shirt today. My role at the Audience Agency is all about really helping people and organisations like yourselves put all of this great data that my colleagues in the evidence team have collected into practice in day-to-day work. So looking forward to sharing some thoughts on how some of this evidence here can actually be applied in the real world a little bit later on. Thanks.
Wow. Cheers. So that's us. And yes, as Ella mentioned, we're going to be talking about bad behaviour, which is a slightly clickbaity title for what we want to talk about. But essentially, we know that there's been this sort of hot topic in the sector over sort of recent months about the way that audiences are behaving post-COVID, and then all sorts of discussions about what's happening, what's different, and so forth. And even before that, I was really conscious of some really interesting work by an academic called Kirsty Sedgman, based at the University of Bristol, where she was talking about the idea of reasonable audience behaviour and the idea of the reasonable audience, and that the sense of certain things to do in an auditorium, or if you're attending events, are classed as reasonable and certain things aren't. And that there's some interesting stuff behind that about different people having different senses of what counts as reasonable and sort of different boundaries around what counts as reasonable. So we thought it would be a useful contribution to all the discussion about so-called audience behaviour and bad behaviour, to have a bit of a think about at least, if you like, the starting assumptions from different types of audiences. So what kind of things do different people think and feel about what counts as behaviour that is sort of positive or less positive in terms of engagement. And once again, as you'll have seen on previous ones of these, if you've been along before, we're drawing on data from the Cultural Participation Monitor. So that's our nationally representative and sort of periodic survey where we look at the whole population and ask them all sorts of questions about their interests and behaviours around culture. But we asked a particular bank of questions in relation to behaviour in this latest wave. That's, this is one of the first sites of this new information, and so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Essentially, is about what people consider to be positive and less positive behaviour. Now, it is worth mentioning that we asked actually several different questions, related questions. If these slides will let me advance, I'll even tell you what they are. There we are. So, broadly speaking, we said, to what extent would you be more or less likely to want to go to an event if you or others could do the following during it? And then we listed out a whole series of behavioural options, which we'll come to in a second. And we asked this for live cultural performances, we asked it for museums and galleries, and we asked it for visitor attractions. We wanted to get a bit of a sense of, do people have different attitudes and expectations in relation to each? And by and large, they did a bit, but not in ways that were particularly surprising. And there were some pretty consistent themes. So for our purposes, we're going to look particularly at performing arts, and just keep it nice and clear, and we're looking at one bit of that data set. We can talk in more detail or separately or follow up to talk more specifically about visual arts, museums, galleries, visitor attractions, etc. if you're interested. So do just drop us a line. But essentially, we asked people, would you be a lot less likely, a little less likely, a little more likely, a lot more likely, or indeed none of those, for a set of behaviours? And what we found wasn't necessarily surprising surprising in the main, but I think it has some quite interesting implications. So that's partly what we're talking about. So this is where it's from. Participation monitor wave 9. Asked a lovely big sample of almost 2,500 people. Here, if you like, here are the results. Here's the kind of the headline picture, which is that there are a whole bunch of things that make people a bit more likely to want to attend, and a whole bunch of things that make people a bit less likely to want to attend. So far, so obvious. But what sits in what category might perhaps be of more interest. So people, by and large, were saying they wanted to be able to take photos and they wanted to be able to eat and drink. So even that is relatively more informal, maybe, than the traditional kind of performing arts audience experience. And linked to wanting to take photos, maybe people also talking about wanting to take videos and recordings and other things like that. But some of the things which have been causing most annoyance, sure enough, by and large, most people say do put them off. So stuff like joining in singing and dancing, making lots of noise, talking on your phone. I mean, this is sort of behavior which is kind of obviously annoying and people don't like it. These figures, by the way, are the kind of the net percentage saying less or more. If, let's say, no one said more, but 30% of people said it would make them less likely, you'd end up with a score of -30. It's that kind of, and that's the way it's working. Notice someone has enabled closed captioning. I should have mentioned it is available at the bottom if anyone else would like it as well. So what we're seeing essentially is that you'll dislike things you maybe would expect. There is a bit of an appetite towards some other things that maybe aren't universally kind of endorsed amongst audiences. So hopefully that's of broad interest. But essentially what we're going to do with this is we're going to take you sort of deeper and deeper into these findings, sort of section by section. So if this is the headline, this is a nice easy version. And then the next level of detail is to say, it's all very well, actually, who thought these things varies. And what we see is that it varies by age and quite strongly. So this is showing the net score that we saw on the previous thing, but split out for these 4 broad age categories. So if on average, people were saying they wanted these ones that are marked in grey, and on average, they didn't want these ones marked in red, you can see that actually that differs for different age groups. And that blue line is the midpoint where it's got a net positive or net negative. So any of the grey ones that dip below the blue line are things that are net negatives for the older age groups, but they're not for the younger age groups, and they're not overall. But generally speaking, all of these lines are heading downwards and to the right. So the older people are, the less likely they are to want various of these behaviours. They want to expect a more kind of potentially more traditional, a little bit more kind of sort of quietly sitting and watching kind of experience, as opposed to the young groups who tend to want to have the license to do a wider range of things, and that kind of is more appealing to them. So that's the overall picture in terms of age. And it's particularly true for, well, it's true across the board, but there are a couple that really stick out in terms of the distinctive picture. And so what we're going to do here is we're just going to filter out all the ones that aren't to do with phones in various forms. So using social media, talking on your phone, using your phone, making recordings. So if we filter those out, what we can see is that all the ones to do with phones are going down more quickly, in most, with one exception. They're going down more quickly than everything else is. So it's a steeper line, suggesting that there's a bigger difference between younger and older groups in terms of how much they care about these things. And the youngest groups are very pro using your phone in general, to the extent that something like using your phone in other ways, for example, using it for social media, is a net positive for under 25s, but it's a net negative overall. And it's particularly a really strong net negative when you get to the kind of over 65s. The slight exception is talking on your phone, which everyone thinks is a bit naughty and rude, albeit less so at the younger age group than the older age group. So that's a slightly flatter line because everyone's starting from a position of being a bit anti. But yes, that's it. So we sort of see it as an interesting picture here where particularly the things around use of phones is strongly correlated with age, even more so than everything else. But what we are seeing, and we'll come back to this when we talk about the implications, is a strong correlation between younger groups wanting more of these behaviours and actively wanting them, whereas older groups actively not wanting them. So far so good. So what we've seen is these things people like, they're linked by age, and phones in particular are a kind of key part of that. I'm now going to hand over to Ella to describe the next levels of detail in terms of analysis.
Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, so moving on from this, so we've seen that people are more likely to do some behaviours more than others, and Ollie very nicely outlined how individual behaviours are associated with different ages. For example, as he said, older people are less likely to attend if people are using their phones. So we sort of, in essence, created, a long list of behaviours that are linked with different age groups. However, in order to understand what is going on behind these behaviours and the reason for people's choices in behaviours, we conducted a principal components analysis. Now, the value of principal components analysis is to create key themes, or as we've listed here, components, that reflect the variation amongst audience behaviour. And it's a very useful tool that highlights important relationships between each of the individual behaviours. And for this piece of analysis, we found 4 key components. And why should we care about these components? Well, by breaking it down into a small number of components, simplifies the variation we are trying to understand, but also allows us to see how these behaviours are connected. So this PCA, using the same data and information from before, identified 4 key themes, referred to here again as principal components. And this explains 87% of the variation about behaviours that people are less or more likely to want to do at an event. And these components are useful to then try to understand why people are behaving at events in these ways. The first component, which explains the largest proportion of the variation, demonstrates an association with anti-phone use and wanting to be involved and active with others. It suggests a desire for being sort of completely immersed in the live event without the use of digital devices, what we sort of like to call the pro in the moment theme. Component 2, we have second along, is suggests a theme where people are wanting to document their time at the event by taking photos and recordings and want to eat or drink, but at the same time, they don't want to disturb others in the process, for instance, by talking on their phone. Component 3, our next one along, suggests that people want to be able to eat and drink and potentially use their phone, but not get involved in anything else, which we feel is sort of reflective of a very cinema type atmosphere. And finally, component 4 illustrates this desire to be integrated with other people and neither pro nor con use of phones. So sort of labelled all of these, the component 1 as a sort of pro in the moment theme, want to be immersed in the live event. The second component, sort of enjoy themselves but not bother others. Our third one, our sort of cinema atmosphere type theme. And the last one, our sort of, what we'll refer to as informal in moderation theme. And these are kind of what broadly shows the variation amongst these behaviours and the relationship between. Now, each of these components apply across all ages and groups. So one person may be reflected in more than one component, but what these themes help us to explain is the variation in behaviours as well as how each individual behaviour is associated with another, i.e. talking on your phone and using your phone are often going to be linked. So the strongest relationship is between behaviours that involve phone usage. And again, the strongest component we see appear is component 1, phone people who are anti-phone use and pro in the moment. And then again, by breaking down these behaviours, it allows us to be more precise on what people want from their events and what audiences are wanting to gain. So that being said, if we look at how this is relevant to different age groups, so we can break down these components by age categories and rank them. And what we see here is a correlation with components 1 and 3 with age. So component 1, which was our anti-phone use pro in the moment component, declines with older age. So what this suggests is that when trying to understand what younger audiences want out of live events, component 1 is very relevant to be able to understand their behaviour and what they want, which is actually that pro in the moment anti-phone use sort of theme. And then this declines of older age. Component 3, which was sort of reflective of our cinema atmosphere theme and the potential to use your phone and eat and drink but not want to disturb others, becomes much more relevant in older age, specifically in those aged 65 and over. Components 2 and 4 broadly have the same relevance across all age groups. So there's not sort of, it doesn't swing sort of either way.
I just jump in just to re-emphasize one thing you were saying.
Yeah.
So this is about the extent to which this factor matters for these different age groups. Exactly which way it matters will vary for different people. So for example, the younger groups are generally speaking more pro phone and more digital. But the key thing is that this factor is really relevant for those groups.
Yes, absolutely. And sort of that kind of, again, illustrates why this is an important analysis tool, because although when looking at individual behaviours may show what individuals want, there's also this idea of the kind of atmospheric thing you want from live events. And again, to reiterate, to be clear, we're not saying that when looking at these components, we're not saying that one component is more important than the other, but what is changing by age is the relative importance of these two components. So where component 3 is not the second most important factor overall, it is the most relevant component to consider when understanding what older audiences want. And component 1 would be the most relevant for understanding what younger audiences want in terms of their live event experience. Yes, which is what is really, really quite interesting to take away. So we can kind of see these individual behaviours being more popular, more likely to happen with certain individuals. But when we actually look at how these behaviours relate to each other, we see these themes developing of what audiences really want out of their events. So the key thing also to take away from this is that these components demonstrate important points with regards to using digital devices. It shows us that there is a real drive for being in the moment at events and anti-phone use that's really coming out as quite strong, and a difference in using digital devices amongst generations that is directly relevant to the experience they want to have at their live cultural event. And this will be very important sort of when we consider, when you're considering how to tailor events for different ages. Lovely. Is there anything you want to add, Ollie?
Well, actually, I thought just might be useful to pop back to this initial summary of the components.
Yeah.
Just, you talked about the fact that component 1 is more important, component 4 is, relatively speaking, less important. But you've got this this line along the bottom about the amount of variance explained. And I thought maybe it's just worth us pulling that out a bit to say that thing about being live in the moment versus digital is explaining, once you account for those kind of those factors, it's explaining about a third of all the difference in attitudes. So that's kind of interesting when you think, if we're having conversations around audience behavior and expectations, like a third of that conversation really needs to be around, covering off that kind of territory, because that's the stuff that is driving. quite a lot of that behaviour, and so on along the list. So yeah, that's the direction. But yes, I think there we are. We'll have chance for more questions in a sec. Shall we maybe pass over to Megan to have some initial reflections about what this might mean, what we might think about this as a result.
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks. Yeah, all really interesting stuff. Sorry, I was jotting some notes as we go now, so if I look confused, it's I'm trying to decipher my handwriting there. But yeah, I guess it's kind of a key thing that kind of jumps out for me for all of this is that, you know, it's quite clear that audience behaviour is changing, and you know, as this younger generation who've grown up with phones, with, you know, the kind of different way of socializing from perhaps the generation ahead of them, as they become the kind of core attenders for live events, they are going to have different expectations of behaviour. But also that we shouldn't be alarmed by that. That's nothing unusual. I mean, live event audiences have not always been kind of all about sitting quietly in rows and being respectful and quiet and well behaved. There's, you know, we go back even 100 years into kind of music hall times or Victorian theatre. You know, they were rowdy, loud places. Go back even further to Shakespeare. You know, the Globe was a complete free-for-all from what I hear. So evolution of audiences is nothing new, and changes in standards of behaviour is nothing new, and we shouldn't be alarmed by it. We shouldn't be surprised by it. It's about how we respond to it. You know, what we consider normal now is actually not that, you know, established. I think the other thing that we need to always remember, it goes across the board, doesn't it, with all of our kind of marketing and audience development activity, is that audiences are really, really diverse. We can't assume that our audience is a homogenous mass of people who all behave in the same way and all have the same expectations and the same motivations. They all want different things. They all have different reasons for participating, for joining in. For some, it is about the social experience, which then may link to them wanting to use their phones during an event to take that photo to put on their Instagram afterwards. For others, it might be about having quite a almost reverential experience of sitting and, you know, appreciating an artist in a very focused way. So definitely not using their phones. So audiences are different, and you can see it. I mean, I'm sure if you've done any sort of audience surveying, I saw a survey response the other week that just made me laugh in a kind of rueful way, because it was clearly an audience member who'd been to the same event, two people who'd been to the same event. One of them had commented something along the lines of, I was so looking forward to this show, but it was completely ruined by the chatty group of school children next to me. And the next person, same event, filled in the same survey, said, it was really wonderful to see a group of young people so engaged and having such a great time at the theatre. So I think, you know, people want different things, they're motivated by different things, and we need to find ways of accommodating that and you know, kind of embracing that. Really, that's a strength, that's a good thing. So yeah, that comes back to thinking about programme, thinking about you know, kind of what those motivating factors are, people, and whether you and your organisation can accommodate that. It may not be right for everybody. Yeah, and just a sort of thought as well. You know, I come from a background very much of doing marketing for shows in venues, and I think something that really helps is the communications both before and after booking, to make sure that we're managing the expectations of the audience. You know, again, going back to that person that had said, oh, I was a bit miffed that there was a school party with me. Perhaps if they'd been aware before they booked that this was likely to be a performance where there were going to be lots of school parties in, they would have booked for a different show and had a great experience. So I think there's probably quite a lot we can all think about in terms of just giving people an idea of what the environment is going to be like and how it's going to feel in the theatre or in the, you know, in the venue, and what is, I mean, we don't have to like prescribe codes of behaviour or anything, that's icky and weird, but just, you know, maybe saying if you are welcoming people taking photos during the show, saying that in your copy, it's okay to have your phones out and take photos. That sets the standard for everybody, because those people who want to take their phones out will go, great, lovely, I want to go to that event. Those that don't and are put off by it will steer clear and go to something else. So just kind of having that clarity of what the environment's going to be like and what is, you know, kind of okay. some venues are pretty good at this, actually. I mean, quite famously, Battersea Arts Centre became a fully relaxed venue a couple of years back. And they're quite explicit about what that actually means and what that kind of means for the audience experience. There will be people coming and going, and there will be lights and there will be noise, and it's okay. So I think maybe just a little bit of tweaking to the way we're communicating might help overcome some of those issues and accommodate some of those changes in what people are looking for an event. But yeah, would love to hear from you guys, kind of out there in the real world doing this stuff of how what changes you're seeing in your own audiences maybe, and how you're responding to them. I think that would be really, really interesting. And we're always here to support that. Shameless plug for things like our segmentation model, Audience Spectrum, which really helps you get a handle on what those different groups of people want to a certain extent. Alongside this research, always happy to have those conversations with you. But yeah, I'd say don't be surprised, don't be daunted. This feels quite natural and normal that society changes and therefore audiences change. But as long as we're aware of what those changes look like and are thinking about how to respond to them, we'll be okay. Cool. Shall I back to you, Ollie?
Yes, thanks a lot, Megan. While you were talking, I realised there's a couple of things I hadn't quite said by way of intro. So one of which is just this idea that we need to differentiate between the idea of like genuinely bad behaviour and abusive behaviour, and the stuff which is around sort of like norms and etiquette around behaviour in a space. So sometimes one can play into the other, because people kind of feel like if people are being informal, that's like a weak version of genuinely bad behaviour, but I think we might want to keep those separate. And the other, just reinforce what you're saying about differentiation, and sort of how do we find new particular moments of compromise where an audience wanting the same kind of experience are in the same place at the same time for the same thing, but that doesn't always have to be identical.